My children and my wife went on vacation while I was left alone in the ICU. When they returned, they were shocked to find new residents in the house. What I did with the money from the sale left them speechless. Their reaction was priceless. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. The pain hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest while I was trimming the hedges in our front yard. One moment I was thinking about how Margaret would complain if the edges weren't perfectly straight. The next I was on my knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The world tilted sideways, and I remember thinking this was it. This was how I'd die, alone in my own driveway at 59. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and worried voices. EMT kept asking me questions I couldn't answer through the crushing weight on my chest. "Sir, do you have any family we should call?" I managed to wheeze out Margaret's number, then David's, then Lisa's. My wife, my son, my daughter. The three people who mattered most in my world. I spent the first 2 days drifting in and out of consciousness in the cardiac ICU. When I finally came to properly, Margaret was sitting in the chair beside my bed, but she wasn't holding my hand or looking particularly worried. She was scrolling through her phone, lips pressed into that thin line she got when something inconvenient happened. "Oh, good, you're awake," she said, without looking up. "The doctor says you had a major heart attack. They had to do some procedure with balloons or something." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw from the breathing tube. She finally looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my chest tighten again. Not love, not relief that I was alive. Irritation. "Samuel, we need to talk about something important." Margaret leaned forward, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "You know David, Lisa, and I have that trip to Europe planned. We leave in 3 days." I blinked at her, certain I'd misunderstood. We'd been planning this trip for months. Well, they'd been planning it. I was supposed to stay home and take care of the house as usual, but now, lying here with my heart barely functioning, I thought surely they'd cancel. "The thing is," Margaret continued, "we've already paid for everything. The flights alone cost $8,000, and you know how hard it was to get reservations at those restaurants in Paris. Plus, Lisa took time off work, and David rearranged his whole schedule." My mouth felt dry as cotton. I managed to croak out, "Margaret, now don't get all worked up. The doctor said stress is bad for your heart." She patted my arm like I was a child having a tantrum. "You're stable now. The nurses said you'll probably be here another week or two, but you'll be fine. It's not like you need us hovering around making you nervous." David appeared in the doorway then, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit. At 32, my son had never wanted for anything. I'd made sure of that. College, graduate school, the down payment on his house, even his wedding had been paid for by dear old Dad. He walked over and gave me an awkward pat on the shoulder. "Hey, Pop. Scary stuff, huh?" He glanced at his mother, then back at me. "Mom told you about the trip?" I nodded weakly, still not believing what I was hearing. "Look, if you really need us to stay," David started, but his tone suggested he was hoping I wouldn't take him up on the offer. "It's just that we can't get refunds on anything, and Lisa's been looking forward to this for months. She's never been to Europe." Lisa chose that moment to breeze in, her designer purse slung over her shoulder and her phone pressed to her ear. At 28, my daughter was the apple of my eye, or so I'd thought. She finished her call and looked at me lying there, connected to monitors and IV lines. "Daddy, you gave us such a fright." She leaned down and gave me a quick peck on the cheek, the kind you'd give a distant relative at a funeral. "But you're tough, right? You'll bounce back from this like you always do." "Whoa." The three of them stood around my bed and I could feel the energy in the room. They wanted to leave. They wanted me to give them permission to abandon me in this sterile room while they sipped wine in Tuscany and took selfies at the Eiffel Tower. Margaret pulled out a brochure from her purse. "Look what we're going to see, Samuel. The Louvre, Versailles, that little vineyard in Provence Lisa found online." Her eyes lit up in a way they hadn't when she looked at me, fighting for my life. "It's going to be magical." I closed my eyes, feeling more exhausted than I ever had in my life. 30 years of marriage, 30 years of providing everything they wanted, working overtime so Margaret could redecorate the house every few years, so the kids could have the best of everything. And now, when I needed them most, they were showing me glossy pictures of their vacation. "The doctor says you're out of danger," Margaret said, her voice taking on that reasonable tone she used when she'd already made up her mind about something. "And really, what would we do here? Sit around watching you sleep? You know how hospitals make me nervous and Lisa gets queasy around all the medical equipment?" David nodded eagerly. "Plus, the nurses here are great. They'll take better care of you than we could." I opened my eyes and looked at each of them in turn. My wife of 30 years, who'd never worked a day since we got married. My son, whose every opportunity I'd funded. My daughter, who still called me for money when her credit cards got maxed out. And not one of them could bear to miss their vacation to stay with me while I recovered from nearly dying. "It's okay," I whispered, though it felt like swallowing glass to say it. Margaret's face broke into a relieved smile. "Oh, I knew you'd understand. You've always been so reasonable about these things." They left an hour later, promising to call from the hotel and bring me back souvenirs. I watched them walk out of the ICU together, laughing about something David had said, already mentally on their trip. Margaret didn't look back once. The silence after they left was deafening. The only sounds were the beeping of my heart monitor and the soft whoosh of the ventilation system. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny holes in each one, trying not to think about how easily they'd dismissed me. A nurse came in to check my vitals. Patricia, her name tag read. She was probably in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. "How are you feeling, Mr. Holloway?" she asked, adjusting something on one of my monitors. "Like I got hit by a truck," I said, trying to make light of it. She smiled sympathetically. "Heart attacks will do that to you. But you're lucky. You got here in time. And Dr. Martinez is one of the best cardiologists in the state." "My family just left," I said, not sure why I felt the need to explain their absence. Patricia nodded, but something flickered across her face, an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well, I'm sure they'll be back soon. Family is so important during recovery." "They went to Europe," I said quietly. This time, Patricia couldn't hide her reaction. Her eyebrows shot up and she stopped what she was doing to look at me directly. "Europe?" I nodded, suddenly feeling ashamed, though I wasn't sure if it was shame for them or for myself, for letting it happen. Patricia was quiet for a moment, then she pulled up the chair Margaret had vacated and sat down beside my bed. "Mr. Holloway, can I tell you something? I've been working in this ICU for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of families deal with heart attacks and strokes and all kinds of medical emergencies." I waited for her to continue. "The families that really love each other? Wild horses couldn't drag them away from this bedside. They sleep in these uncomfortable chairs for weeks if they have to. They fight with the doctors to get answers, they learn medical terms they can't pronounce, and they certainly don't go on vacation while their loved one is recovering from a major cardiac event." Her words hit me harder than the heart attack had, because deep down I'd known something was wrong with the way they'd left, but I'd been making excuses for them my whole life. That night, alone in the ICU with only the machines for company, I began to think about my life in a way I never had before. The days blurred together in that hospital room. 3 weeks of staring at the same water stain on the ceiling, listening to the endless beeping of machines, and watching other patients get visitor after visitor while my bedside remained empty. Margaret called twice from Paris, both times to complain about the hotel Wi-Fi being slow. David sent one text asking if I needed anything, but when I replied that I'd like to hear his voice, he never called. Lisa posted 17 photos of herself at various European landmarks, but couldn't find 5 minutes to FaceTime her father. It was during the second week that I really started paying attention to the other patients around me. The man in the bed next to mine, Joe, had suffered a stroke about the same time I'd had my heart attack. His wife, Carmen, barely left his side. She'd pulled 2 chairs together to make a makeshift bed and had been sleeping there every night, despite the nurses telling her she should go home and rest. 43 years we've been married, she told me one afternoon, while Joe was napping. I'm not about to leave him alone in this scary place now. I watched her smooth his blanket and adjust his pillow, even though he couldn't feel it. The tenderness in her movements made something ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. Your family will be back soon, I'm sure, she said kindly, having noticed my lack of visitors. They're in Europe, I said. the words still feeling foreign in my mouth. Carmen's hand froze on Joe's blanket. She looked at me with the same expression Patricia the nurse had worn, a mixture of disbelief and pity. "Oh," was all she said, but that single word carried volumes. Across the hall there was a woman named Betty who'd been admitted for complications from diabetes. Her daughter lived 3 states away, but she'd driven straight through the night when she got the call. She'd been there for 2 weeks, coordinating with doctors, helping her mother with physical therapy, and sleeping on a cot the hospital had provided. "Mom's been taking care of everyone else her whole life," the daughter told me, while we were both getting coffee from the machine down the hall. "Now it's my turn to take care of her." I thought about that conversation for hours afterward. Had I spent my whole life taking care of everyone else? And if so, why wasn't anyone taking care of me now? The memories started coming back in waves, memories I'd buried under years of routine and responsibility. I remembered when David was 12 and broke his arm falling off his bike. Margaret had been at her book club, so I'd rushed him to the emergency room, held his hand while they set the bone, and stayed with him all night when the pain medication made him sick. When Lisa was in college and called crying because she'd failed an important exam, I'd driven 4 hours to comfort her and help her talk to her professors about making up the grade. But when had they ever done the same for me? I tried to remember a time when I'd been sick or hurt, and they'd rallied around me. The closest I could come up with was about 5 years ago when I'd thrown out my back-moving furniture for Margaret's latest redecorating project. I'd been laid up for a week, and she'd complained constantly about having to bring me food and help me to the bathroom. "I didn't sign up to be a nurse," she'd said, irritated that I couldn't reach the remote control that had fallen on the floor. Patricia became my lifeline during those long days. She worked the day shift, and whenever she had a free moment, she'd stop by to chat. She had a way of asking questions that made me really think about my answers. "Tell me about your family," she said one afternoon while checking my blood pressure. "Well, Margaret, that's my wife. She likes nice things, always has. When we got married, I promised her she'd never have to worry about money, and I've kept that promise. She's been able to stay home, redecorate the house whenever she wants, buy whatever clothes she likes." "That sounds generous," Patricia said carefully. "What does she like about you?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, and then closed it again. What did Margaret like about me? I paid for everything. I never complained when she spent money. I let her make all the decisions about our social life and our home. But what did she actually like about me as a person? "She appreciates that I'm a good provider," I said finally. Patricia's expression was gentle, but sad. "That's what you do for her, Samuel. But what does she like about who you are?" I couldn't answer that question. After 30 years of marriage, I honestly couldn't think of a single thing Margaret enjoyed about my personality, my sense of humor, my thoughts, or my dreams. She liked what I could give her, what I could do for her. But me? The person inside this body that was fighting to heal? I wasn't sure she'd ever really seen that person at all. "Tell me about your children," Patricia said during another visit. This was easier territory, or so I thought. "David's doing really well. He's a financial advisor making good money. I helped him get started, of course, paid for his business courses, helped with the down payment on his office space. And Lisa, she's finding herself, you know? She's tried a few different careers, but she's talented. I've been supporting her while she figures things out." "They sound like they've benefited a lot from your support," Patricia said. "How do they support you?" Again, I found myself speechless. When was the last time David had called just to see how I was doing? When had Lisa ever asked about my day, my worries, my hopes for the future? Their calls always started the same way. "Hey Dad, I hope you're doing well," and quickly moved to whatever they needed. Money, usually, or help with something, or advice that they'd ask for and then ignore. "They're busy," I said weakly. "David's building his business, and Lisa's got a lot going on." Patricia nodded, but I could see she wasn't buying it. "Samuel, can I share something with you? Something I've learned in all my years working here?" I nodded. "There are 2 kinds of families that come through these doors. There are the families where people genuinely love each other, where they show up not because they have to, but because they can't imagine being anywhere else when their loved one needs them. And then There are the families where people are connected by obligation, convenience, or what they can get from each other. He paused, letting that sink in. The first kind of family would never leave someone alone in the ICU to go on vacation. They'd cancel the trip, lose the money, and never think twice about it. The second kind, well, they find reasons why the trip is more important than the person. I closed my eyes, feeling something crack open inside my chest. Not my heart this time, but something deeper. Something that had been holding together the illusion of my family for decades. That night, I lay awake thinking about every birthday, every holiday, every major moment in my life. Margaret always made sure to get me gifts, expensive ones that she'd picked out and I'd paid for. The kids always remembered to call on Father's Day, usually asking about their inheritance or floating some new financial need. But when was the last time any of them had really seen me? When had they asked what I wanted, what I dreamed about, what scared me? When I'd had the heart attack, their first thought hadn't been, "Thank God he's alive," or "We need to be with him." It had been, "How do we salvage our vacation plans?" I thought about Joe and Carmen in the next bed. I thought about Betty and her daughter, who'd driven through the night. I thought about all the families I'd observed during my stay. Families where love looked like sacrifice, like presence, like caring more about the person than the inconvenience. And then I thought about my own family, sipping wine in French cafes while I recovered from nearly dying, alone. For the first time in my 59 years, I began to understand the difference between being loved and being used. And once I understood that difference, I couldn't unknow it. The crack in my chest widened, and I realized something that terrified and liberated me at the same time. I had been living my entire adult life with people who saw me as a resource, not as a person. And now that I could see it clearly, I had to decide what I was going to do about it. The turning point came on my 18th day in the hospital. I was finally strong enough to walk to the window without feeling like my chest was going to cave in, and I stood there looking out at the parking lot, watching families come and go. A teenage boy was helping his elderly father into a wheelchair, moving slowly and patiently as the old man struggled with each step. The tenderness between them was so obvious, it made my throat tight. That's when I saw him, my neighbor Frank, walking toward the hospital entrance. Frank lived 2 houses down from us, and we'd exchanged pleasantries over the years, but were hardly close friends. I was surprised to see him here, and even more surprised when he appeared in my doorway 20 minutes later, holding a small potted plant and looking genuinely concerned. "Samuel, Jesus," I heard what happened. "How are you holding up?" Nobody had asked me that question, really asked it, since I'd been here. Not Margaret during her brief phone calls, not the kids in their perfunctory texts. Frank pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down like he planned to stay a while. "I'm doing better," I said, and meant it, for the first time in weeks. "Margaret said you were doing fine when I ran into her before they left for their trip. But hell, you look like you've been through the ringer." Frank shook his head. "Heart attack's serious business. My dad had one when I was about your David's age, and we practically lived at the hospital for weeks." Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. "They mentioned the trip?" Frank's expression shifted slightly. "Well, yeah, I was surprised they were still going, to be honest. If it were my wife." He trailed off, seeming to realize he might be saying too much. "It's okay, Frank. What would you have done?" Frank was quiet for a moment, then looked me straight in the eye. "I would have canceled the damn trip. Some things are more important than money, you know?" We talked for almost 2 hours. Frank told me about his father's recovery, about how the whole family had rallied around him, taking shifts at the hospital and helping with his rehabilitation. He told me about his own scare with kidney stones last year and how his wife had slept on their bathroom floor for 3 nights to be close by if he needed help. "That's what you do when you love someone," he said simply. "You show up." After Frank left, promising to come back the next day, I sat in that hospital bed with a clarity I'd never experienced before. The fog of decades of self-deception had finally lifted, and I could see my life for exactly what it was. I wasn't a husband and father. I was a bank account with legs. I wasn't loved. I was useful. And the moment I stopped being useful, the moment I became the one who needed care instead of providing it, they'd abandoned me without a second thought. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to me just 3 weeks earlier. I was going to take control of my life. For the first time in 30 years, I was going to put myself first. The next morning, I asked Patricia to help me contact my lawyer, Robert Chen. Robert had handled our wills and some property transactions over the years, but he'd also become something of a friend. He was at the hospital within 2 hours of my call. "Samuel, you look terrible," he said, but with the kind of honest concern I'd been craving. "How are you really doing?" "I'm doing a lot of thinking, Robert, about my life, about my family, about what I want the rest of my years to look like." Robert pulled out a legal pad and his pen. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath and began explaining what I wanted to do. Robert's eyebrows climbed higher with each item on my list, but he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me for a long moment. "Samuel, are you absolutely sure about this? These are pretty drastic changes. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "Rail, and you understand that once we start this process, there's no going back quietly? Your family is going to know something's changed the moment they return." I thought about Margaret sipping champagne in first class while I'd been fighting for my life. I thought about David and Lisa posting photos of themselves at the Coliseum while I lay alone in the ICU. I thought about 30 years of being taken for granted, of having my love and generosity seen as obligations rather than gifts. "Good," I said. "It's time they learned I'm not as disposable as they think I am." Robert spent the next hour taking detailed notes. I wanted to sell our house, the 4-bedroom colonial that Margaret had insisted on, with the formal dining room we never used and the master suite she'd redecorated 3 times. I wanted to liquidate the joint savings accounts, the investment portfolios I'd built up over decades of careful planning. I wanted to buy myself a smaller, simpler place where I could live comfortably without the burden of maintaining a showcase for Margaret's entertaining. "What about the kids' inheritance?" Robert asked delicately. "What about it? They're adults. David's making good money and Lisa needs to learn to support herself. I've been enabling her dependence long enough. And Margaret?" I was quiet for a moment, thinking about my wife, the woman I'd promised to love and cherish, who couldn't be bothered to stay by my side when I nearly died. She'll get her legal share of whatever's required by law. But her days of spending my money on trips I'm not invited to are over. Robert made more notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When he finally closed his notepad, he looked at me with something I wasn't used to seeing in people's eyes when they looked at me: respect. "I have to say, Samuel, I've known you for 8 years, and I've watched you be incredibly generous with your family. Some might say too generous. If this experience has shown you that generosity wasn't appreciated the way it should have been, then maybe these changes are long overdue." Over the next few days, while I continued my physical recovery, Robert worked behind the scenes to set everything in motion. A realtor came to the hospital to discuss listing the house. I signed papers to liquidate investments and close joint accounts. I reviewed listings for smaller homes and neighborhoods I'd always found appealing, but Margaret had dismissed as not our style. The nurses had started calling me their miracle patient. Not because of my medical recovery, though that was going well, but because of the transformation in my demeanor. Patricia commented on how much more alert and engaged I seemed. "You look like a man with a purpose," she said while helping me with my physical therapy exercises. "I am," I said, and realized I'd never felt more energetic in my life, despite having a major heart attack 3 weeks earlier. Frank visited every other day, and I found myself looking forward to his conversations more than I'd enjoyed talking to anyone in years. He told me about his work, his hobbies, his thoughts on everything from politics to gardening. And he asked me about my thoughts, too, not what I could do for him, but what I actually thought and felt about things. "You know," he said during one visit, "I always thought you seemed like you had more to say than you ever got to say around your family." He was right. Around Margaret, David, and Lisa, I'd learned to keep my opinions to myself unless they specifically related to solving one of their problems or writing one of their checks. My role was to nod, agree, and provide. But with Frank, I found myself sharing thoughts I'd been keeping locked away for years. I told him about books I wanted to read, places I wanted to travel, hobbies I'd always been interested in but never had time for because I was too busy working to fund everyone else's dreams. I talked about maybe getting a dog, something Margaret had always vetoed because pets were too much trouble. And I mentioned thinking about taking some art classes, learning to cook something besides the basic meals I made when Margaret was out with friends. "Those all sound like great plans," Frank said. "What's stopping you?" For the first time in my adult life, the answer was simple: nothing. A week before my discharge, I received a postcard from Margaret. The front showed the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and the back contained 3 sentences. "Having a wonderful time. Italy is beautiful. See you when we get back." Not "I miss you." Not "I hope you're feeling better." Not "I can't wait to see you." I held that postcard in my hands and felt the last remaining thread of obligation to my old life snap cleanly in two. By the time Dr. Martinez cleared me for discharge, the house was under contract, my new place was purchased, and my old life was packed away in boxes. All that remained was to wait for my family to come home and discover that the man they'd left behind in the ICU was gone forever. I was finally ready to meet the people who'd replaced him with a vacation. I was in my new kitchen, unpacking dishes and humming along to music on my radio when my phone started ringing. I glanced at the screen and saw Margaret's number, but I didn't feel the usual jolt of anxiety that her calls used to trigger. Instead, I felt oddly calm as I answered. "Samuel? Samuel, what the hell is going on?" Her voice was shrill, panicked. "We just got to the house and there are strangers living there, strangers in our house." I continued unwrapping a coffee mug I'd bought for myself, a simple blue one that said, "World's Best Dad," ironically enough. "Hello, Margaret. How was your trip? Don't you dare act casual with me. Where are you? What have you done?" "I'm at home," I said simply. "Home? What do you mean home? Some woman answered our door and said she bought the house. She had papers, Samuel, legal papers." I could hear David and Lisa in the background, their voices raised and agitated. Someone was crying. Lisa, I thought. Someone else was swearing. Definitely David. "Yes, she did buy the house. I sold it 3 weeks ago, right after you left for Paris." The silence on the other end was profound. I could practically hear Margaret's brain trying to process what I'd said. You sold our house? Our home? You can't do that. I live there. My things are there." "Your things are in storage," I said calmly, opening my new refrigerator to put away some groceries I'd bought earlier. "Unit 247 at Secure Storage on Maple Street. I paid for 3 months in advance." "Storage?" Margaret's voice cracked. "You put my life in storage?" "I put our old life in storage. I'm starting a new one." David grabbed the phone. "Ted, what the fuck is wrong with you? You can't just sell the house without telling us." I was quiet for a moment, letting his anger wash over me without absorbing it. It was remarkable how different his fury felt now that I wasn't trying to please him. "Actually, David, I can. My name was on the deed. I sold it." But where are we supposed to stay? We just got back from a 3-week trip. We're exhausted. And now you're telling us we don't have a home to come back to?" The irony was so thick, I almost laughed. "Funny you should mention that. I spent 3 weeks recovering from a heart attack with nowhere to feel at home either." But I managed. Lisa took the phone next, her voice thick with tears. "Daddy, please, you're scaring us. This isn't like you." "Where are you? We'll come get you and we'll figure this out together." For just a moment, hearing my daughter's voice crack with emotion, I felt the old familiar urge to fix everything, to make it all better, to sacrifice my own needs, to make theirs go away. But then I remembered lying alone in that hospital bed while she posted pictures of herself laughing in Rome. "I'm at my new house, Lisa, and we're not going to figure anything out together. You're adults. You'll figure it out yourselves." "New house?" Margaret had taken the phone back. "What new house? With what money?" "With our money, Margaret. The money I earned, that I saved, that I invested for 30 years while you spent it on redecorating and designer clothes and trips to Europe while your husband recovered from nearly dying." The words came out calmer than I felt, but each one was deliberate, honest, and long overdue. "You're having some kind of breakdown," Margaret said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "The heart attack, the medications, being alone in the hospital, it's affected your thinking. We need to get you help." The only thing that affected my thinking was having 3 weeks to think clearly without any of you around to distract me with your needs and demands. I gave them the address to my new place and hung up. They'd be here within the hour, I knew. Margaret wouldn't let this go without a fight. My new house was everything our old one hadn't been. It was smaller, simpler, but it was mine. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened into a living room with big windows that let in lots of light. There was a small backyard with fruit trees and space for a garden. The mortgage payment was less than half what we'd been paying, and I'd bought it outright with cash anyway. I'd spent the last week since my discharge making it feel like home. I'd bought furniture that I liked, comfortable pieces instead of Margaret's formal showcase items. I'd hung pictures that meant something to me instead of expensive art, chosen to impress visitors. I'd filled the kitchen with foods I actually enjoyed eating instead of the elaborate ingredients Margaret needed for her dinner parties. For the first time in decades, I was living in a space that reflected who I was instead of what others wanted me to be. I was arranging books on my new bookshelf when I heard cars pull into my driveway. Through the front window, I could see David's BMW and Lisa's SUV parked behind my modest sedan. All 3 of them got out, looking around my quiet neighborhood with expressions of disbelief and disgust. Margaret was first to the door, pounding on it like she was trying to break it down. When I opened it, she pushed past me without invitation, her eyes scanning my small living room with obvious horror. "Samuel, what have you done?" she breathed. David and Lisa followed her in, their faces mirrors of confusion and anger. Lisa was still crying, mascara streaked down her cheeks. David looked like he was trying to control his temper and failing. "This is where you're living?" Margaret asked, taking in the modest furnishings, the simple decor. "This is what you traded our beautiful home for?" "This is what I bought with my money, yes." Your money?" David stepped forward. "Since when is it just your money? You're married, Dad." "Half of everything belongs to Mom. Half of what's left belongs to your mother legally. But I was under no obligation to maintain a house she couldn't be bothered to come home to when I was hospitalized." Margaret sank into my new recliner, the one I'd chosen specifically because it was comfortable for reading, not because it matched any decor scheme. She looked genuinely bewildered. "I don't understand what's happening here. We go on one little trip, and you have some kind of mental breakdown and destroy our entire life?" "One little trip," I repeated. "You left me alone in the ICU to go on one little trip." "You were fine," Lisa protested. "The doctor said you were stable." "I had a massive heart attack, Lisa. I could have died. I almost did die. And instead of staying with me, instead of caring for me while I recovered, you went sightseeing." "We called," Margaret said weakly. "You called twice in 3 weeks." David sent one text. Lisa posted dozens of photos of herself having fun, but couldn't find time for a single phone call. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the small clock I'd put on my mantel. They were looking around my new home like they were seeing it for the first time, and I realized they were seeing what I chose when they weren't there to choose for me. David was the first to recover. "Okay, fine. Maybe we should have handled the trip differently." "But Dad, you've made your point. Now let's be adults about this and figure out how to fix it." "Fix it?" I sat down in my comfortable chair and looked at each of them. "There's nothing to fix. This is how things are now." "You can't be serious," Margaret said. "You can't just upend our entire life because you're upset about one decision." "It wasn't one decision, Margaret. It was 30 years of decisions. 30 years of me being valued only for what I could provide, not for who I am." Lisa sniffled. "That's not true, Daddy. We love you." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. When was the last time she'd asked me about my day, my thoughts, my feelings about anything that didn't involve solving her problems or funding her lifestyle? "Lisa, when was the last time you called me just to talk? Not because you needed money or help or advice, but just because you wanted to hear my voice." She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. The silence stretched on. "When was the last time any of you asked me what I wanted, what I dreamed about, what scared me or excited me or made me happy?" They stared at me blankly. Margaret's mouth worked soundlessly, like a fish out of water. "I'll tell you when," I continued. "Never. Because you've never seen me as a person. You've seen me as a provider, a source, someone who exists to make your lives easier and more comfortable. David's face was getting red. That's not fair. We appreciate everything you've done for us. You appreciate what I've done for you. But do you love who I am? Do you even know who I am? The question hung in the air like smoke. And in their silence, I had my answer. Margaret stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. We're not doing this. Samuel, you're going to come home with us right now, and we're going to talk to a lawyer about getting our house back. No. The simple words stopped her cold. This is my home now. You'll need to figure out your own housing situation. Housing situation? Margaret's voice was climbing toward hysteria. I'm your wife. Lisa is your daughter. We're your family. I stood up too, facing the three people I'd spent my adult life serving, and realized I felt nothing but tired pity for them. No, you're people who happen to share my DNA and legal documents. Family doesn't abandon each other in hospitals. Family doesn't choose vacations over being present during crisis. I walked to the front door and opened it. You're welcome to visit if you can learn to treat me with respect. But this conversation is over. They stood there gaping at me like I'd grown a second head. The man they knew, the man who gave in, who apologized, who fixed everything, was nowhere to be found. And for the first time in my life, I was proud of his absence. They didn't leave when I opened the door. Instead, they stood there like stubborn children, waiting for me to back down the way I always had before. Margaret's face had gone through several color changes, and David was clenching and unclenching his fists, like he was considering whether to physically drag me out of my own house. Dad, you're not thinking clearly, David said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable. You just had a major medical event. You're probably on medications that are affecting your judgment. Let us help you. I almost laughed. Now they wanted to help me. Not when I was lying alone in the ICU, not when I was struggling through physical therapy with no family support, but now that their comfortable arrangement was threatened. My judgment is fine, David. In fact, it's clearer than it's been in years. Lisa stepped forward, and I could see her mentally switching tactics. She put on the same pouty expression that had been melting my resolve since she was 5 years old. Daddy, please. I know we hurt your feelings, and I'm sorry. We're all sorry. But you can't punish us forever for one mistake. One mistake? I closed the front door and turned to face them fully. Lisa, let me ask you something. How much money have I given you in the past 5 years? She blinked, caught off guard. What does that have to do with anything? Humor me? How much? She looked at David and Margaret for help, but they were both staring at her, waiting for an answer they probably didn't want to hear. I don't know exactly. You've helped me through some rough patches. $43,000, I said quietly. I have the records. Rent money when you quit your job to find yourself. Car payments when you decided you needed a bigger SUV. Credit card bills when your shopping got out of hand. The down payment on your condo. The money for your photography equipment that's been sitting in your closet for 2 years. Lisa's face went pale. I turned to David. And you? How much for your business startup? The wedding? The house down payment? David's jaw tightened. That was an investment in our family's future. $67,000, I said, not including the college tuition and graduate school I paid for while you were finding your path. I looked at Margaret last. And you. 30 years of supporting a woman who never worked a day after we got married. The house renovations every few years because you got bored with the decor. The clothes, the spa treatments, the girls' trips, the car you had to have because the neighbor got a new one. Margaret lifted her chin defensively. I was raising our children. I was maintaining our home. The children you're referring to are 32 and 28 years old. What exactly have you been maintaining lately besides your social calendar? The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of truth none of them wanted to acknowledge. I walked to my kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, taking my time. When I came back, they were all still standing there, looking shell-shocked. Here's what I realized during those 3 weeks alone in the hospital, I continued. I've spent 30 years being an ATM with legs. You withdraw what you need, you say thank you, and then you go live your lives until the next time you need a withdrawal. That's not, Margaret started, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. In all those years, Not once did any of you ask what I wanted. Not once did you consider that I might have dreams of my own, goals that didn't involve funding yours. When I had my heart attack, your biggest concern wasn't my health or my fear or my pain. It was whether your vacation would be inconvenienced. David's face was getting redder. You're being completely unreasonable. We're family. Family helps each other. I stared at him. When was the last time you helped me, David? We help you all the time. How? Give me one example of how you've helped me in the past year. He opened his mouth, then closed it, opened it again. We came to your birthday dinner. The birthday dinner I paid for, at the restaurant you chose, where you spent the entire evening talking about your business problems and asking me for advice. You ignored. Lisa tried again. Daddy, families aren't about keeping score. You're right, they're not. But they're also not about one person giving everything while everyone else takes everything. That's not family, Lisa. That's exploitation. Margaret finally found her voice again. So what? You're just going to abandon us. After 30 years of marriage, you're going to throw it all away. I sat down in my chair again, suddenly feeling very tired. I'm not throwing anything away, Margaret. I'm choosing to stop letting you throw me away. You threw me away the moment you decided a vacation was more important than staying with me while I recovered from nearly dying. The words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret's face crumpled, but I couldn't tell if the emotion was genuine or performed. We made a mistake, she said, her voice small. People make mistakes. Yes, they do. And then they face the consequences of those mistakes. David stepped forward aggressively. What consequences? What are you talking about? I reached into the folder I'd left on my coffee table and pulled out a document. I've changed my will. The effect was immediate. Lisa gasped. David went very still. Margaret's face went white. The house you expected to inherit? I sold it. The retirement accounts you were counting on? I've set them up as annuities that will provide for my own care as I age. The life insurance policy that would have made you all comfortable? I've reduced it to the minimum required to cover burial expenses. You can't do that, David said, but his voice had lost its conviction. I can, and I did. You're all adults with your own lives. It's time you started funding those lives yourselves. Lisa started crying again, but this time it felt different. Less manipulative, more genuinely distressed. But Daddy, we were counting on that money for our futures. Counting on money for my death for your futures, I corrected. Do you have any idea how that feels, to know that your family is sitting around calculating how much better off they'll be when you're gone? Margaret stood up abruptly. This is insane. Samuel, you can't just change everything because you're angry about one trip. I'm not angry about one trip, Margaret. I'm devastated by 30 years of being invisible to the people who should have seen me most clearly. I stood up too, walking to the window that looked out on my small backyard. There were birds at the feeder I'd put up, and the afternoon light was soft and golden on the grass. Do you know what I've been doing for the past week since I got out of the hospital? I asked, without turning around. None of them answered. I've been living, really living, maybe for the first time in decades. I bought books I wanted to read instead of the ones that would look impressive on shelves. I cooked meals I actually enjoyed instead of whatever you all preferred. I sat in my garden and watched the birds and didn't worry about whether the lawn was perfect for your friends to see. I turned back to face them. I've been happy for the first time in years, genuinely happy. And do you know why? They stared at me silently. Because for the first time in my adult life, I'm living for myself instead of for your approval and comfort. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. So that's it? You're just done with us? I looked at each of them. My wife, my son, my daughter. The people I'd loved and sacrificed for, and supported and enabled for 3 decades. And I felt something I'd never felt toward them before. Indifference, not hate, not anger. Just a complete absence of the desperate need to please them that had driven my entire adult life. I'm done being your resource, I said quietly. If you want a relationship with me, a real relationship where you see me as a person instead of a provider, then we can work toward that. But those days of me fixing your problems and funding your choices while being invisible as a human being, yes, those days are over. David made one last attempt. "Dad, be reasonable. Where are we supposed to live? Mom doesn't have anywhere to go." I looked at him with something approaching pity. "The same place you expected me to figure out how to live after I recovered from my heart attack while you were touring European vineyards. You'll figure it out." Margaret gathered what remained of her dignity and headed for the door. "This isn't over, Samuel. We'll fight this. The will, the house, all of it." "You can try," I said calmly. "But you'll find that a man who's been supporting 3 other adults for 30 years has learned quite a bit about legal documents and financial planning." They left in a flurry of slammed doors and squealing tires. I watched their cars disappear down my quiet street and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time since my heart attack, I was completely alone by choice rather than by abandonment. And the difference was everything. 6 months after I'd been left alone in that hospital bed, I was sitting on my front porch with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a view I'd never bothered to notice in 30 years of living in our old house, where the formal dining room faced east and the windows were always covered by Margaret's expensive drapes to protect the furniture from fading. My new routine had become something I looked forward to every day: coffee on the porch, reading a chapter or 2 of whatever book caught my interest, then tending to my garden. I'd discovered I had a talent for growing things: tomatoes, herbs, flowers that attracted butterflies, and hummingbirds. Simple pleasures that I'd never had time for when my days were consumed with work and worry about everyone else's needs. The house had settled into feeling like home in a way our old place never had. Every piece of furniture was something I'd chosen. Every book on the shelves was something I actually wanted to read. The kitchen was stocked with foods I enjoyed, and the refrigerator wasn't cluttered with Margaret's complicated ingredients for dinner parties I'd never wanted to host. Frank had become a real friend, stopping by a couple times a week for coffee or an evening beer on the porch. We'd discovered we both enjoyed old movies and had started a tradition of watching classics together on Sunday afternoons. He'd introduced me to his wife, Carol, who was as warm and genuine as he was, and they'd included me in a few of their social gatherings with other couples in the neighborhood. It was remarkable how much easier it was to make friends when you weren't constantly anxious about what other people needed from you. I'd joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at the community garden, and even signed up for a pottery class on Thursday evenings. Simple activities that brought me joy without any expectation of reciprocal benefit. The attempts at contact from my family had been predictable and, frankly, pathetic. Margaret had tried everything from tearful phone calls to legal threats to showing up at my workplace. She'd even attempted to use mutual friends as intermediaries, spinning elaborate stories about my mental health and her desperate concern for my well-being. David had been more direct in his approach, angry phone calls demanding I stop this nonsense and threatening to contest everything I'd done. He'd been particularly furious when he'd discovered that I'd also removed him as a beneficiary on my retirement accounts and life insurance policies. Lisa had alternated between dramatic pleas for forgiveness and bitter accusations about my selfishness. But what struck me most about all their communications was that none of them ever asked how I was feeling. None of them inquired about my recovery from the heart attack. None of them showed any curiosity about what I was doing with my life or whether I was happy. Even in their attempts to win me back, they remained focused entirely on what I could do for them, rather than who I was as a person. The legal challenges had been half-hearted and unsuccessful. As I'd told Margaret, 30 years of supporting other people had taught me quite a bit about protecting assets and making legally sound decisions. Everything I'd done was completely within my rights, and Robert had made sure every document was ironclad. I was coming back from the community garden one afternoon, my hands dirty from planting fall vegetables, when I saw Margaret's car in my driveway. She was sitting on my front steps, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. She stood up when she saw me approaching, her hands twisting nervously. "Hello, Samuel." "Margaret?" I didn't invite her in, didn't offer her coffee, didn't ask her how she was. I simply waited. "I've been staying with Lisa," she said, as if this information should move me somehow. I nodded, but said nothing. "It's been difficult. Lisa's place is small, and she's been stressed about money since—" She trailed off, perhaps realizing that finishing that sentence would not help her cause. "Since she had to start supporting herself," I finished for her. Margaret flinched slightly. "We've been talking, the three of us, about everything that happened. About the trip, about the hospital, about how we handled things." I waited. "We realized we made some mistakes." "Some mistakes," I repeated flatly. "Okay, we made serious mistakes. We should have canceled the trip. We should have stayed with you. We should have been there when you needed us." It was the closest to an apology I'd gotten from any of them, but it felt hollow, calculated. An admission designed to get something from me rather than a genuine acknowledgement of harm done. "And?" I said. Margaret looked confused. "And what? And what would you like me to do with that information?" She stared at me like I'd asked her to solve advanced calculus. We want to work things out. We want our family back. Our family." I set down my gardening tools and looked at her directly. "Tell me, Margaret, what do you miss about our family?" She opened her mouth quickly, then closed it, thinking. "I miss us, being together, being a family. What did we do together as a family? In the last 5 years, what activities did we share? What conversations did we have that weren't about money or problems or things you needed me to handle?" Again, that blank stare. "I'll help you," I said. "The answer is nothing. We didn't do anything together except exist in the same spaces while you all pursued your individual interests with my financial support. That's not. We had dinner together. We sat at the same table while you talked about your book club, your shopping, your plans with friends I was never invited to meet. David talked about his business troubles. Lisa talked about whatever crisis was consuming her that week. And I listened and nodded and offered solutions and wrote checks when requested." Margaret's face was getting red. "You make it sound like we never cared about you at all." "When was the last time you asked me about my day?" Silence. "When was the last time you asked what I was reading, what I was thinking about, what I wanted to do with my free time?" More silence. "When was the last time you showed any interest in who I am as a person rather than what I could provide as a husband and father and bank account?" Margaret's lip trembled, but I felt nothing. No urge to comfort her, no guilt about her distress, no impulse to take back my words to make her feel better. "I want to try," she whispered. "I want to learn how to be a better wife." I studied her face, looking for something genuine, some sign that she understood the depth of what had been broken between us. But all I saw was a woman who was scared of losing her financial security and the social status as a married woman. "What do you love about me, Margaret?" The question seemed to physically stagger her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what aspects of my personality do you love? What are my good qualities as a person? What do I bring to your life besides money and stability?" She stood there opening and closing her mouth like a fish, and I had my answer. "Margaret, we've been married for 30 years, and you can't name a single thing you love about who I am as a person." Tears started rolling down her cheeks, but they felt like performance rather than genuine emotion. "I can learn," she said desperately. "I can get to know you better. We can start over." I looked at this woman I'd been married to for 3 decades and felt a sadness that had nothing to do with our current situation. I felt sad for both of us. For her, because she'd never learned how to love another person, and for me, because I'd spent so many years accepting so little. "Margaret, you can't learn to love someone you've never bothered to see, and I can't teach you how to see me after 30 years of being invisible to you." She crumpled then, sinking back onto my front steps and sobbing in a way that might have been genuine. But even her grief felt foreign to me now, like watching a stranger's pain. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked through her tears. I felt a flicker of something, not pity exactly, but recognition of her helplessness. The same thing I had to do when you all left me alone in the hospital. Figure it out. I gathered my gardening tools and walked toward my front door. "Samuel, please," she called after me. "Don't you think we deserve a second chance?" I stopped and turned back to her one last time. "Margaret, you had 30 years of chances. You had every day of our marriage to choose to see me, to know me, to love me, as a person instead of a provider. You had 3 weeks while I was fighting to recover from nearly dying to realize what mattered and come home to be with me. I shook my head slowly. I don't have any more chances to give. That was 8 weeks ago. I haven't heard from any of them since. Frank tells me through the neighborhood grapevine that Margaret has moved in with her sister in Phoenix, that David is struggling with his business without my financial backing, that Lisa has moved to a cheaper apartment and taken a job as a server at a chain restaurant. I feel no satisfaction in their struggles, but I feel no guilt either. They are living the natural consequences of their choices, just as I am living the natural consequences of mine. My consequence is this: I wake up every morning in a home that reflects who I am, rather than what others want me to be. I spend my days doing things that bring me joy, rather than things that bring others comfort. I go to sleep every night knowing that every choice I made that day was mine to make. I have a dog now, a gentle golden retriever mix named Charlie that I adopted from the local shelter. He greets me with pure joy every time I walk through the door, asks nothing from me but basic care and attention, and gives me the kind of unconditional love I'd spent 30 years trying to earn from people who were incapable of providing it. Yesterday was my 60th birthday. I spent it exactly how I wanted to. Coffee on the porch with Charlie at my feet, working in my garden, reading a book that made me laugh, sharing dinner with Frank and Carol, watching an old movie that brought me comfort. No one called to wish me happy birthday. No one sent a card or a gift. And for the first time in decades, my birthday was exactly what I wanted it to be: peaceful, authentic, and mine. I am 60 years old and I am finally living my own life. It took a heart attack and abandonment by the people I'd loved most to teach me that I was worth loving, worth seeing, worth choosing. Some lessons come late, but they still have the power to save you. I saved myself and I have never been happier.